Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, and share buttons. Well, it's happening already, just 16 days into 2023. But if you remember, we did a video a couple of weeks ago titled, What Will Happen in 2023? My Thoughts. And I came up with 5 highly probable events that I thought had a great likelihood of occurring in 2023. And number 2 on that list was a major currency collapse. And I pointed out that the most likely candidate for that was Japan. And so Japan has the largest debt to GDP ratio in the world, meaning they're the most indebted nation in the world. It's at 240%. That's more than double the United States. All the trillions of dollars in debt the United States is in, Japan is twice as worse off as the United States is, and that's saying a lot. So we've had some major developments in the last couple of days. What are they? Let's look at them. Start with this article right here from U.S. News and World Report. It says, what is happening in Japan's bond market? It says, market forces have pushed Japanese government bond yields above policy targets. So remember, they set this target where they are not going to let the rate that they're paying on their debt go above that amount. So it says the moves are the biggest test in 7 years of yield control in Japan, and dealers say the central bank's dominance of trading is making the market barely functional. Here's what is happening and what it means. Consisting of more than $7.9 trillion of debt, Japan's government bond market is one of the world's largest, but over the past 7 years of a policy called yield curve control, it has become one of the least liquid. To stimulate lending, growth, and inflation, the Bank of Japan has pinned short-term interest rates at negative 0.1%, and 10-year yields around zero since 2016. In that period, it has 3 times loosened its tolerance for the movement of the 10-year yield above or below zero, most recently in December, and we talked about that in that last video, when it suddenly widened its target band from plus or minus 0.25%, which it really wasn't, it was minus or at. They bought every single one they could that went over 0.25%, to plus or minus 0.5%. So they switched that. Because bond yields rise when prices fall, defending the upper limit of the band has forced it to buy bonds in vast quantities, leaving it owning more than half the market. So the Bank of Japan has gone out, they've just created trillions of yen and gone into the market and bought Japanese government debt to the point where the Bank of Japan now owns more than half of all outstanding Japanese government debt. To me, that's a Ponzi scheme, but let's go on and read. It says, trading volumes have shrunk as market participants have struggled with the Bank of Japan's sudden and large interventions. So the market now waits on the central bank every day. A little after 10 a.m., we check what the Bank of Japan will announce, and that determines the market move of the day, said Tomohiro Mikajari, head of yen and non-yen fixed income trading in Japan for Barclays. It's hard to take positions without checking whether the Bank of Japan conducts emergency bond buying operations, and if so, which tenors the Bank of Japan targets and at which prices. So tenors, that's a fancy way of saying maturities or the length of the borrowing period for those bonds. So you have some bonds that are monthly, 3-month, 1 year, 5 year, 8 year, 10 year, 15 year. There's different lengths of that maturity, of the maturity on those bonds. It says Japan's yield curve, a line linking yields at increasing maturities, which in most countries is an arc with higher yields for longer-term bonds, has also grown a kink. So you would expect higher yields, higher interest rates for longer dated bonds. So if I borrow money from you for 1 year, you would demand less interest from me than if I borrowed money from you for 10 years because of the added risk of inflation, insolvency, all sorts of things that made you feel like I may not get paid back, so I want more reward for the risk I'm taking. It says because the Bank of Japan binds only overnight and 10-year rates, market participants have priced higher yields on all other maturities, driving 8-year yields to 0.62%, above the 10-year yields, and 15-year yields far above at 1.15%. I wouldn't call it exactly far above. So you're lending currency to the Japanese government, currency that they print, by the way, and that they are printing to buy their own debt, for 15 years, and in exchange, they're going to give you 1.15% for borrowing those yen for 15 years. That to me is, I don't know who's taking that, but I guess there's people out there, at least for the moment. It says the sheer scale of the Bank of Japan's ownership and buying volume, as well as short selling from foreign investors who are betting on a policy shift, means the market has little to no role in setting benchmark debt prices or the cost of public financing. The bank's ownership of the 368th series of 10-year Japanese government bonds is near total at 97% on January 10th. So this particular issuance of 10-year Japanese government bonds, it's now at the point where 97% of them have been bought by the Bank of Japan. They've just printed yen and gone out and bought those bonds back. It says up from 86.4% on December 22nd. The Bank of Japan held 86.8% of the 367th Series 10-year bonds on January 10th, up from 81.9% on December 20th. So they're out there in mass just buying these bonds. It says foreign short selling in recent weeks has only added more pressure to an already distorted market. Interest rate swaps, which in most markets closely track sovereign bonds, rose above 1% at the 10-year maturity on Monday. That swap yield may indicate where the 10-year bond could be if the Bank of Japan left the market alone. Now, I think if the Bank of Japan left the market alone, we would see something we haven't seen in a really long time, not in one of the largest economies in the world. It says short-term swaps have spiked too. The attack, it's an attack, the attack on Bank of Japan, mainly from foreign investors, it's the exact opposite. The Bank of Japan is attacking the foreign investors by printing this currency and running this Ponzi scheme. But anyway, it says continues, and that is putting upward pressure on yields, said the head of Japan rates research at JP Morgan Securities. What does it mean? Given the extreme market expectations, the Bank of Japan must either abandon its yield curve control policy or at least double the size of its band to restore any semblance of market functionality, experts say. Again, there is no market functionality because the government is going in and distorting the free market by buying its own bonds up, printing currency to buy its own bonds. Even if the Bank of Japan widened the band for the 10-year bond to 75 basis points, the yield would be pinned at 0.75% unless overseas yields fell. Unless the Bank of Japan reduces its presence in the market and changes its stance that it is controlling the yield level, market liquidity won't improve. For global markets accustomed to a perennially dovish Bank of Japan and cheap yen funding, a shift this week would be a jolt. The yen has rallied significantly since December. It has reached 7-month highs since the Yomiuri Daily reported last week that the Bank of Japan would review the side effects of its monetary easing at this meeting. So what's going on? So they've, for a long time, they had said, we are not going to let the yield on our 10-year debt go above a quarter of a point, 0.25%. So you lend currency, you lend these yen to the Japanese government for 10 years, and in exchange, you get a quarter of a percentage point of interest. Well, needless to say, that didn't fly too well. There wasn't a whole lot of demand for that. So the Japanese government was buying these, and even with all that they were buying through the Bank of Japan, all the currency they were printing to buy these bonds, it still went above 0.25%. So they had to change their policy and raise it to 50 basis points, or 0.5%. So now you lend the currency to the Japanese government for 10 years and they'll pay you a whole 0.5 percentage point in exchange for all that risk you're taking. Well, now that is under assault. If we look right now at the markets, last I looked it was 0.519, so that's breaking. They have a meeting on Wednesday where they will meet, and it's believed they could raise that level, the so-called level they're going to defend that used to be 0.25 point and now is 0.5 point, to 0.75, or now you'll get 0.75 of a percentage point of interest for taking all that risk and lending them these yen that they're just printing, that are losing their purchasing power. What a great deal. What a bargain, right? So, guys, it's a Ponzi scheme. That's all it is. And Japan is not alone. Pretty much every government in the world is running this to some extent. Japan's problem is they are the most indebted. But we're going to see this also play out in other countries, probably in the European Union, eventually in the United States. It's inevitable. It's basic math, unless, and again, this isn't going to happen, unless those governments decide, hey, we're spending too much. Let's cut back the spending. Let's rein in that spending, lower, lessen the power of government, limit government, let the free market take over, let growth take over. That isn't going to happen. But that's pretty much the only way out, but they will not go that way. They will print anything they can do. And we all know where this heads. It's a house of cards. It's going to fall down. It's a Ponzi scheme. So, at some point, the investors and these other maturities, so the Japanese government's going out, they're buying these overnight debt instruments. They're going out and buying the 10-year bonds. But the other ones are floating in the free market, basically pegged to what the Bank of Japan is doing. At some point, those investors are going to wake up and say, why are we even holding these things? Let's get rid of them. And they're going to dump them. And the Bank of Japan is going to be forced to buy every single bit of Japanese government debt that is on the market. And then you have the tax revenue that the Japanese government collects, and then everything else that they spend, because they're spending, just like the United States, they're spending more than they're bringing in tax revenue. All of that's just going to be printed away. They're just going to print the yen to buy it. There's only two ways out of this. They can continue to pursue this policy so that they don't default on their debt, technically, right? The purchasing power that's going down, but they can pursue that policy and end up with hyperinflation of the Japanese yen, which is what we were talking about. We would see, the collapse of a major currency. So we'll either see hyperinflation of the yen, or they could say, you know what, we don't want to go that route with hyperinflation. So they'll simply default on all this government debt and it will go unpaid and they'll start over with a clean slate. Either way, you're going to have major market pain that's felt globally. Japan is the 4th largest economy in the world. Some say the 3rd. I'm counting the European Union as the number 1 economy. But if you break up the individual nations and count those instead, then you've got the United States, China, Japan. So if Japan has hyperinflation of their currency, or they default on their debt, you have a major global financial crisis on your hands, which was the number 1 thing we talked about was most likely to happen in 2023. And of course, what does that mean? Well, when that happens, and I believe it's inevitable, they're going to say, well, to stop this, how do we stop this in the future? If only we had had insight into what was going on, how could we do that? Well, if we had central bank digital currency, we would have been able to see how bad the problem was. We would have been able to see that, what these hedge funds were doing. Because what's going to happen? Because there are only two choices. There's hyperinflation of their currency or default on their debt. There's going to be people out there placing large bets on one or the other occurring. They're convinced that either they would never hyperinflate or they would never default, and they will leverage up, borrow a bunch of money, move all their chips to that side of the table. And when it doesn't happen, when it goes the other way, that financial institution is going to declare bankruptcy, and it's going to cause a contagion effect, because there's probably going to be multiple financial institutions, trust, hedge funds, whatever else, pension funds, whoever is playing in this market, buying these Japanese government bonds, making these types of deals that are going to go under, and it's going to create a cascading contagion effect within the financial system. And so the governments will say, well, if we could have seen what those institutions were holding, and if we had central bank digital currency, we would have had that intelligence. We would have known. We could have put a stop to it. And that will be a very appealing argument to many people who have lost their jobs in the middle of a global depression, who are having a hard time paying their rent, buying food, buying fuel. And so they'll hear that argument and think, that makes sense. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. Oh, and you know what? They're offering me $10,000 if I go sign up for that central bank digital currency, or $20,000 or whatever it may be. So you'll have the carrot and the stick, everything set up there, the incentives for people to go sign up for central bank digital currency. I believe it's all going to come on the other side of this next financial crisis. What we're also going to see as the world goes into this economic chaos is this is when this happens, because again, I believe this is just math. It's just a matter of when it happens, not if it's going to happen. This is going to be a generational financial crisis similar to the Great Depression and the impact that had globally. And you're going to see, when those types of things happen, people look for strong leaders, and countries often go to war. And so all of this sets the stage for the rise of a figure like the Antichrist. And we've talked about before how Europe, with its energy crisis right now, is going to be ground zero for the global depression that is coming. Their industries cannot be competitive on a global scale with their energy prices the way they are. So even if they don't have shortages and blackouts when it comes to energy, the prices they're paying for that energy are too high. Even if they don't pass them on to, even if they're subsidized by government, then you have this run up in debt from fiat currencies, the same thing we're looking at in Japan. Somebody has to pay the price. There's no free lunch here. So this is a house of cards that's going to collapse. It's not going to end well. And all of this, I believe, sets the stage for, sets the table for the events we read about in the Bible, particularly Revelation chapter 6. And so, the world needs to wake up. If you don't know Jesus Christ, you need to come to know him now. The great news, the good news, is that while we were still sinners, Jesus willingly went to the cross and spilled his blood for you and me to cover our sins, atone for our sins, so that we could have eternal life. That's the good news. And the additional good news is that we now live in the season of the Lord's return. Jesus said, when you see all these things take place, you know that I'm near. I'm right at the door. And the things he said to look for are the same things we see in our world today. So guys, Jesus is coming back. He's coming soon. And we see world events taking shape that tell us that, everything is falling into place for that to happen. So let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. Would you buy a Japanese government bond, tie your money up for the next 10 years so that you can get 0.5 percentage point of interest on that? Maybe you would. I wouldn't. But what do you think? Maybe they can keep this going for years and years. Maybe I'm completely wrong. If so, let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you think. In the meantime, God willing, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.